Welcome back to Tree Lady Talks. We are so pleased to be back. Noel and I have had a break for a few months and we are starting with a bang. We have got Nadina Galle. Nadina, I am so pleased to meet you because I've been following your career.
Oh, likewise, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to help you kind of kick off this second chapter of Tree Lady Talks.
Thank you. Well, the reason why you're here is because you've just written, and it's out now, a new book, The Nature of Our Cities. My goodness. Now, in my role, I read a lot of books. I'm privileged to speak to many authors, all of which is hugely interesting. But to be honest, I left your book till a little bit late. And I said to Noel last week, oh, I haven't started the book. Right. And I was blown away, and I'll tell you why. Because the way that you write, it's like a novel, a factual novel with characters, and it is so engaging. But before we dive into the book, let's hear about you. Tell us about your childhood and what got you into nature.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Sharon. That was definitely a huge thing that I wanted to accomplish with the book. I think the biggest compliment that you can get with a book is that it's a page turner and that people don't want to put it down. So I appreciate that. And a lot of the book, I mean, I've wanted to write a book since I was a kid. So to finally be here feels a lot like full circle. And a lot of what ultimately inspired the book really started in childhood too. I'm Dutch originally. I was born in the Netherlands, but grew up in a really typical North American suburb in southwestern Ontario in Canada. And it's a really typical type of urban development where, at least in the 80s and the 90s, I think property developers maybe had either more resources or more space or perhaps more forethought or less of that. It's kind of an interesting discussion. But I grew up in a really beautiful green neighborhood, but I saw a lot of that change around me in the 25 years that I lived there. In that area, really saw it change where my parents, where they still live, their house really became the center of the city in terms of all the development that happened around them. It used to be quite on the outskirts of the city. And what you saw was this really kind of classic subdivision type development where everything is completely deforested, and then we build these cookie cutter houses, and then we go in after the fact and we put in these little seedlings and saplings, because I think there is this intrinsic want to have nature and to want to be around nature, but it is very much an afterthought in urban design. And I always thought that was the most bizarre thing. Why would we build a new neighborhood and call it, Forest Heights or Clear Creek, or give it, a very nature inspired name, but develop in that way? I just thought it was so strange. And more really importantly than that, I compared it to when we would have the opportunity to visit family and friends in the Netherlands. They had a completely different way of developing. It seemed very much like nature was much more as a forethought there, the way that they really designed neighborhoods and a very community-based approach. And this style that I was seeing in North America seemed very different. So it was, as a kid, already comparing and contrasting the two. But I love to write, and English was my favorite class in high school. So I wanted to go to journalism school. But when I discovered at 18 that I was waitlisted, and ultimately I never actually got into the best, and really you could argue only journalism school in Canada, I needed to rapidly come up with a plan B, and that was the outdoors. And I'd always loved being outside and had a very outdoors childhood. So when I discovered that was something you could study in school, I mean, I later learned they call it ecology. That was what I decided to study.
That's great. And so what I love about the book also is you open the first chapter and it almost feels dystopian. You describe a massive heat wave, but you can talk us through how the impact of living in a city in a heat wave and what it does to our bodies and our minds.
Yeah, my publisher really wasn't sure if we should go ahead with this prologue and epilogue that I wrote, because I've had some hesitations about it as well, because as you say, it starts on a quite dystopian note, and I really pride myself in my work in being quite optimistic and quite hopeful and quite positive, because I feel this doom and gloom narrative of climate anxiety, it really has not propelled the environmentalism movement, I think, in ways that have been particularly positive, particularly helpful. So I really don't like to subscribe to that kind of doom and gloom, but I did feel that it helps kind of put into perspective what a city can feel like if nature becomes a permanent afterthought, if nature becomes something that we do not prioritize in the design of our neighborhoods and in the maintenance of our neighborhoods. And I think one of the most compelling ways where we feel it as individual human beings is during a time in a heat wave. It's really on that individual level where you can feel, oh, this is what it feels like to stand under the shade of a tree. This is what it feels like to stand in a park versus this is what it feels like to stand in the middle of an asphalt parking lot. You can feel that deep down on every human being can feel that, and they can argue that they feel it, and it's something that is it's bipartisan. It's a really innately human experience, and I think that was a good place to start the book, just to kind of bring us back to why should we even care about having nature in our cities? And of course, heat waves is just one part of that. But I find it's one of the things that we're feeling more and more, and we're feeling it in cities across the UK, for example, across Canada, across the Pacific Northwest. Places that are not supposed to get that hot are getting that hot, and we're feeling it as individual human beings.
Yes, because by describing what's happening in your body and in your mind, you really get the message across so much better than a bunch of statistics. So,
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the terms you use, I'm just going to jump right into the phrase that you coined for a PhD, the Internet of Nature. What do you mean by the Internet of Nature?
Yeah, the Internet of Nature came about in 2019. I was asked to deliver a TEDx talk, and it was really the first time, even though I'd done some speaking, it was the first time that I was really asked to consolidate all of my ideas into not only a 15-minute presentation, but an engaging and exciting 15-minute presentation. And I don't know if it was Teddy Roosevelt. I think it's often referred it's often attributed to him, this idea that I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. And I love that quote so much. And I felt much in the same preparing for this as, you go into academia and your questions only get bigger and the papers only get longer and the discussions only get longer and the debates get longer. And I felt I was so drawn to this idea of science communication. So at the time, I was working on this idea of, we have this so-called smart city movement where we're using technologies to be able to improve how we light our cities, how we manage our cities, how we deal with our waste management, our mobility. But we're leaving behind the very existence of urban life, which is the ecosystems that our cities are built on. And I thought that was such a strange oversight by the smart cities movement. And at the same time, we had this movement of wanting to have more green cities and more nature in our cities. And I felt like there's a lot that these two can learn from each other. So as I was discovering all of these people and practitioners and innovators around the world that were using technology to apply to nature and enhance nature in cities, I realized that if I really wanted to bring that to a broader market, it needed a name. It needed something that people could refer to that movement by. And Internet of Nature came up as, in part, this tongue-in-cheek reference to the Internet of Things, the most ubiquitous kind of smart cities technology, although Internet of Nature is definitely not just about sensors. And at the same time, Internet of Nature is kind of this tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that nature already has its own version of the internet, that trees are always in communication with each other, but trees and all kinds of plant life are in communication with one another. And that perhaps that biological communication network has been disrupted in our cities, and we might actually be able to use our version of technology to help bridge those two together again and can reconnect really both nature, cities, and people ultimately.
Well, a really sort of micro example of that is you talk about how nature is connected together. Well, we think in terms of arboriculture as tree roots connecting to each other through mycorrhizae fungi and the whole wood wide web. And that is disrupted often in urban areas by singular tree planting in pits which can't link together. And that is a completely crazy thing to do, and people are learning from that. But you also talk about using technology to enhance, say, tree planting even better with sensors. So it's a really neat example of how nature needs to link together, let's say with a long big tree pit, and how technology can really create efficiencies in watering and monitoring. But I think in the past there's been a sort of a perceived, even if it's subconscious, a perceived tension between those who love tech and those who love nature. I mean, even if you just call up in your mind a sort of techie person, what they might look like, a nature person, what they might be like, that there is this sort of separation, and that has to end. And I'm really pleased to see it is ending. And you tell it really well through the characters in the novel, as I'm calling it, the factual novel. And the first guy that I came across, struck a chord, was a guy called Greg Mosman, and you describe him in his council office. Well, I really related to this because I'm ex-local authority, I'm ex-municipality.
I think a lot of people will.
Yeah, you tell us what it was like and what he was like.
Yes, Greg Mossman, I don't think you would mind me saying this. I think he's a very typical arborist, urban forester working in a municipal government. I describe in the book trying to find his office and only to find it kind of tucked away in a back corner with these like boarded up windows and these very low ceilings. And it was just such a real life example how often urban forestry and the parks department are treated within municipal governments, right? As kind of this, again, this afterthought. I think that will kind of be the key word of this conversation, Sharon. This afterthought of like, oh yeah, and those are the people that take care of like some of this green stuff that we have.
Yeah.
You know, it's like we're very much like put them in a basement somewhere, you know, no one really cares about them. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with in those positions, because you have these people that are deeply, deeply passionate about trees and tree lovers in their hearts and their souls and their mind, body, and soul, completely invested in this. Yet every day they're coming up with the frustration that their work is not being taken seriously. And that's really what I try to depict with the scene with Greg. Is he is, he's in his office chair in this really dingy looking office building, and he is on the phone with a resident, and they're trying to explain to him where this tree is that they're communicating about. And, you know, he's got all these Post-it notes everywhere, and he's got pen marks on his hands, and he's, trying to keep tabs on all of these hundreds of thousands of trees that are under his management. Meanwhile, the city of Boston, we should say, he worked for the city of Boston, didn't have a functioning tree inventory at the time. So it was really, and that's why I call the paper, the chapter Saving Trees on the Paper Trail, because it's really what it was. It was a paper trail, and that's all there was. And of course, this is an obscene way to deal with, and we would never, ever, ever accept this kind of management of our roads, our bridges, our buildings, our electrical systems, our cybersecurity systems. But here we are putting trees in the urban forest, something that has, links to public health, the economy, to climate, to social well-being. It has such an impact on absolutely everything in the city. And we're treating it like it can just be discarded at any moment's notice. And I go into Greg's office and I ask him, and I'm nervous to ask this because I can see how busy he is. Could you please let me know the locations of red maple trees? Because I was studying, actually, to your earlier point, Sharon, mycorrhizal associations in red maple trees planted in tree pits in the city of Boston and Cambridge. And he's extremely kind and very generous with his time. And he, me thinking, here I am thinking, like, I'm sure he's got a database or a map or something that he can show me these locations. He's like, well, I actually don't have that. We don't have a functioning tree inventory. But let me tell you what. I will drive around. When I drive around for the next 2 weeks, I will jot down, locations of where I see red maple trees. And me being like, thinking like, how can he possibly identify like red maple trees from like, his driver's window? But of course, this is a real arborist we're talking. He knows this urban forest like the back of his hand. But that's exactly sketching the danger of it. You have one person in city council that knows everything about every single tree, but it's all in their heads and on their Post-it notes and scribbled on their hands. And there's, if that person leaves or something happens to that person, God forbid, that information is lost as well. So it was such a great way to open that chapter, because I just feel like it sketches the problems that we're dealing with in municipal urban forestry in so many different ways.
it brilliantly portrays a problem. And I'm going back now to 1988 when I worked for a local authority as a new tree officer straight after my degree. And there were no computers on the desk. And when we had a new tree preservation order, we plotted it in a huge, dusty A1 sort of square map book, and I would draw on the TPOs with a felt pen and write them on a piece of paper that was kept, and that was our TPO archive. Things have improved, but I like to think that this is my hopeful future, that now we know all this stuff about all the things that trees do for us. Now that we can measure them, measure all the benefits, which we'll talk about later in the interview, might say somebody in 20 years' time doing a PhD in this, walk in to see the urban forester and be taken up to the elevator into a glass-fronted office in the top of the building because they are the most important people. Maybe we'll get there. But yes, I mean,
I would love to see Greg in his corner office on his brand new swivel chair. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, I agree. I agree.
And I think often the passion that we feel, we're on a mission, is kind of exploited, really. Mm-hmm. But I'm hopeful for change. But one of the issues, I mean, databases are powerful because when we know what we've got, we can quantify it and then we can advocate for it. And I was really interested to read about Fabio Durarti of MIT City Lab with his LiDAR. Perhaps you could explain about... Yeah.
So Fabio, he didn't do LiDAR. He did an analysis of Google Street View imagery.
Oh, I got that essentially wrong.
It's similar. It's similar in the sense that you work with a scanner that you put on top of a car or on top of a backpack if it's an area that's inaccessible by cars. And Google Street View doesn't take LiDAR, although that is something I'm sure that they'll do in the future if they're not already thinking about it. And basically you're just creating these panoramic photos of all of your surroundings. And what Fabio did with that technology, Fabio's he was one of my supervisors at MIT while I was there. He's a big proponent of making better use of data that's already out there. So you have two schools of camp in the smart city movement. The one who's obsessed with creating new forms of data, but there's also something, you have data quantity and you have data quality. And Fabio is obsessed with this idea of data quality. Let's look at the data that's already out there and try to glean as many insights of that as we can before we, come up with the next best sensor or mapping technology to come up with even more data that we're not quite sure what to do with. So I always really respected that about him. And he had seen Google Street View imagery be used for a bunch of different purposes already, like checking for cracks in the facades of buildings, for example, or checking to see things like vacant buildings or areas where cars were parked. You can really, if you think about it, there's so much information in these panoramic photos that we can be using to understand things about our cities. And he came up with this idea of this might be the best means to objectively measure how much canopy we have at the street level. And I think he made this great argument. Of course, Google Street View is not going to give you, a full map of your greenery in your city, because of course it doesn't look at parks and it doesn't look at people's backyards or at trails. But it does give you this great objective means of measuring canopy at the street level, which of course you could argue is some of the most important greenery because it's at that interface between people and traffic and activity happening at the street, or, road workers, pedestrians, commuters, you name it. And essentially what he did is he, together with his team at the MIT Sensible City Lab, came up with an algorithm to essentially mask out everything that you would see in a panoramic image like this, everything except for the green canopy of the tree, which was quite difficult to do because if you can imagine, in the earliest iterations of it, green facades of a painting or a building was painted green, it would pick up on that. Obviously not a tree, that doesn't count. Or if a car was green, for example, it would pick up on that. So they ultimately got it to a level where it was really, really accurate. And then they could measure something that they called the Green View Index. And they did this for, I think it was 10 cities originally. And then they've slowly been adding the more cities to it's called Treepedia, to the Treepedia list, which you can check out on their website. And they've also made the entire script available to the public. So anyone that has the Python, it's built on the Python skills, can actually map the Green View Index for their own cities. And if it's done correctly, they'll add it to the website as well.
Wow, that's fantastic. And all this information again is power, and we can see where the gaps are, and that can help inform policy rather than just randomly planting trees. So it's useful. It's not just for academia. It's not just to say we've got this. It's like, where are the negatives? And then cross-referencing that with different data such as social deprivation and health inequality, etc., and highest levels of pollution. So this is the way it's going. It's very exciting. And
yeah, and an important, sorry if I could just add one point on that, something that's critical to say there too is it's not, because the Treepedia website is set up where you have Geneva next to Boston, next to New York, next to Sao Paulo. So it almost feels like what they call a green Olympics, but it's really not meant to be comparing, Geneva to Boston and vice versa. What it's really meant to do is to be able to zoom in on that city and be able to compare neighborhood to blocks to streets by streets, to be able to compare within the city, really within the city, and understand where is greenery lacking. So for example, in the city of Sao Paulo, and Fabio actually comes from Brazil originally, so it was extra special to him to use the Treepedia analysis. And what they found there is that certain streets in Sao Paulo actually had 4 times as much greenery as other streets did. So it was a huge kind of wake-up call to the municipality of Sao Paulo to take a much better look at, if we're going to invest in greenery, what might be the first places to do so at a street level.
Yes, because you've made a really important point, because there has been this race by politicians for tree numbers. We're going to plant 1 million trees, etc. But I don't agree with that blanket approach, because each city has its own cultural and geological and historical sort of setting, and we need to honour that. It needs to retain its own distinctiveness. It's not about one thing fits all. So that's a very good point there. But in terms of heroes, another hero is really Fiona Watt. And throughout this, you made a passing comment. As she came back from her 3rd maternity leave, I was almost wiping my brow on her behalf. Tell us about Fiona.
I know, she's a hell of a woman. I know, yeah, in more ways than one. Fiona was a recent forestry graduate from Yale, and she started working under Commissioner Stern, who was the Parks Commissioner of New York City at the time. And he was one of the first that actually that really he came up with this idea of arborside. Well, maybe he came up with it, but he was really one that popularized it, that said, hey, there is going to be criminal charges and fines for anyone that actually damages a tree in New York City, which I think is such a great it's great for a parks commissioner to come out and say that, but I think it offers like a sense of legitimacy to the public green infrastructure. Now, mind you, Commissioner Stern was a little bit late on that notion, because I can give you an example of the Law Book of Amsterdam, which actually has written in the law book, which dates back to 1454, I'm pretty sure, that if you damage a street tree that is owned by the municipality, you can actually get your right hand chopped off.
Oh, wow.
So this is the original arborside. So this is not a new concept, but I think he definitely popularized it in New York City at the time. And Howard Stern, the commissioner, he also decided that we should have for the first time a census about how many trees are at least on public land in New York City. And Fiona was the one that really led that campaign from the beginning. She was just a recent grad. Commissioner Stern basically said in a press conference, we're going to do this, call this number. And on the other end of the line was Fiona. I think she was a 22-year-old grad at this point, who was trying to just get as many volunteers as she could. And they basically, the very first tree census of New York happened in 1995, and they went out, a bunch of volunteers, and they went out and just mapped as many trees as they could by hand. I mean, that's what they did with pen and paper.
Yeah,
and it's amazing.
To that. Yeah.
Exactly. I think many people can. And what's amazing about the tree census in New York since is that it happens every 10 years. And every 10 years, of course, a decade go by and all the technological revolution that happens in that time. So it's this amazing kind of moment in time where you see these huge technological jumps every 10 years. And of course, 2025 is right around the corner. So it'll be interesting to see if they use, for example, LiDAR technology and some of these, smartphone technologies and augmented reality technologies. I mean, there's so much that we can use now to make not only this process more engaging and exciting for volunteers, but also make sure that the data is really, really good. Because unfortunately, in the first and even second iteration of the tree census, the feeling was really good to do this as a community, but the data was kind of so-so. And a lot of arborists and urban foresters in the Parks Department were like, okay, that's a fun exercise, but there's nothing here that we can really use. And that's changed drastically.
Yes, because of the links with things like iTree as well. So, no, that's really good. And you spoke about actually laws, and
Yes.
you interviewed friend of the show, rock star himself, Matt Wells from Santa Monica, formerly from New York City.
Yes.
And I mean, when we spoke to him, it's always a pleasure. And he spoke about, the wonderful mapping and understanding about the tree population in Santa Monica and the great efforts they're taking within the public realm to increase canopy cover. But his frustration at what's happening in the private realm and actually the difficulty in the USA of actually being able to legislate against tree removal on private land. Tell us about your conversation with Matt and what he's trying to do.
Yeah, Matt always draws this great parallel between this idea that you can't exercise your way out of a bad habit or out of a bad diet. And in the same way, you can't outplant the losses that we're feeling on private land with planting new trees on public land. Like, I think the last estimate that Matt had is that Santa Monica has room for some 2,000 more trees on public lands. And they are drastically losing trees on private land, mostly because of the addition of ADUs or additional dwelling units that are built in people's backyards. Of course, with the housing crisis being what it is and housing prices being what they are, there's a lot of extra money up for grabs if you're able to expand your home in that sense. But unfortunately, that is often at the cost of not just trees, but often big, large, mature, statured trees, which of course, as you know, Sharon, and a lot of the tree folks in the audience will know, but the benefits of a large mature tree often outweigh the benefits of a small one, 8-to-1. So there's these huge, ecosystem services, these free benefits that trees provide to us that are being lost. So Matt has done a lot of work to advocate for a private tree ordinance, which is something that is deeply controversial, especially in a land like the States, where, of course, they're all about individual liberties and individual property rights and these things, which I myself can understand in a lot of degrees. I myself find myself within certain regards leaning towards a very libertarian mindset. I can understand a lot of that. But when I think about trees in densely populated communities, we need to move away from the idea that that tree, and this will get some people riled up, but we need to move away from the idea that that tree belongs to that current homeowner, that current owner of the land. It makes absolutely no sense that that tree can be there for upwards of 200 years. You own that home for maybe 3-5 years, decide you want to expand your patio, what have you, and remove an 80-year-old, 100-year-old tree. Of course, there are always concessions that we need to make, and there's tree risk and safety and all of those things. But it is an odd thing that we've come to own trees rather than become stewards of them on our so-called private lands. And I think especially in densely populated communities, you might feel ownership over that tree because its roots and its trunk happens to be on your, and I'm using quotes here for the listening audience, a piece of land. But the benefits that tree provides, those benefits, they go as far as 500 meters out from that tree in terms of the public health benefits, the aesthetic value, the beautification of that area, the wildlife that it has a home for. So we really need to move away from this idea that we are owners of trees, and rather we are much more stewards of that tree. And Matt he is very open to using whatever technology is available to be able to provide better measurements of, as you said, knowledge is power, to provide a better measurement of what we have. And he's really using, together with a company called Planet Geo, high resolution satellite imagery to map on ideally an annual basis the trees on private land and which ones might go missing, to offer, really a way to start to both incentivize but also potentially fine those that don't follow the tree or the private tree ordinance. If one comes to Santa Monica, it's still something Matt is working on.
Very interesting. And I think one of the mechanisms for that might be evidence that the trees are providing an environmental benefit, and that removal of those trees causes environmental harm. Because I can't remember the name of the municipality, but there was one in the States that you write about that said private trees are really important. We're going to fine developers for taking out trees. And the developer actually sued the municipality. Yes. And they were found to be within the law, because at that time I understand that the ruling was that removal of the trees doesn't demonstrate environmental harm. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, it was Canton, and now I'm forgetting if it was either in the state of Michigan or of Illinois, but the municipality name was Canton, and it's true. And it went up all the way to the, not the highest, but the highest court in the federal, but in the highest court in the state, there was an appeal made. And it was a really interesting precedent that was set, where indeed they ruled in the developer's favor, saying that they could not demonstrate that environmental damage was caused by the removal of those trees, when of course we know that that was absolutely the case. Now, one of the things I will say is that particularly case, it wasn't a super highly densely populated area. I think if it had been, I think it would be easier to show the harm, the environmental damage, not necessarily just in terms of environmental damage, but also damage for public health and well-being. Because I think we've seen so far is that with the, we've now have software tools like iTree, for example, which are able to put a monetary value and statistics on the benefits of trees that they're able to provide to us. But that only gets us so far, because I think it's still really difficult for people to say, okay, so what about the stormwater? So what about the filtering of the air? So what about the CO2 that's sequestered? I think we're going to have a much more luck in being able to translate those costs in terms of cost to human health and well-being. And there's some fantastic research coming out by a researcher of the USDA Forest Service called Jeffrey Donovan. And what he's shown, there was a study from 2013 where he showed that the rise of emerald ash borer, which killed a bunch of ash trees, hundreds of thousands of them, that they were not correlated, not caused, it's very difficult to prove, but associated with 12,500 extra cardiovascular deaths and 6,500 additional lower respiratory deaths in those neighborhoods. In fact, the neighborhoods that lost the majority, or more, I should say, ash trees actually had higher deaths associated with them as well. So we're getting to this point. He also later in Portland was able to show the inverse, that the trees that a nonprofit planted in Portland actually resulted in longer lifespans than areas where they didn't plant trees. So we're getting there to the point, again, these are associations. This isn't like, this is a, we cannot take urban forestry research into the lab and control every factor. We simply can't. But we're getting to the point where we can start to show these associations. And I think that's going to be crucial in being able to hopefully show the courts that this is having real damage.
I think the association is based on volume. You're talking on a big sort of landscape scale and a large population scale. And I think that has power. Of course, you can't say, oh, the oak tree that grew up in Mr. Smith's back garden led to him living 10 years longer, because Mr. Smith might have decided to take up smoking at the age of 75 and heavy whiskey drinking and stop playing, football and ate a load of lard. So you can only look at it on a huge. I mean, I'm not a proper scientist like you,
but it's true.
It's true. But interestingly, you talked about. So what about pollution mitigation? So what about stormwater management? Let's look at human health. Well, there's another thing that is driving positive change in the UK. So listeners will know. I primarily work in the planning and construction industry in terms of arboriculture at the moment. And one of the things that's driving positive change is where there is a monetary value associated to a tree, and the developer thinks, and I say, well, if you take that out, you're going to pay this. If it's a street tree, for example. And the other thing that's very new in the UK is something called biodiversity net gain, which is to do with the whole of nature and ecology and a series of metrics. I mean, I'd been in a meeting this morning and with a client and a site, and I didn't particularly like what they were planning to do. Well, I didn't like it, and I told them so. And rather than just me saying, well, there's a loss to the ecology, there's a loss to the landscape, there's going to create a negative landscape impact, sense of place. But I agree, a lot of the trees are, they've got ash dieback disease and there are other issues there. But I said also biodiversity net gain, and the developer's partner said, oh, we can just buy credits off site. I said, no. And actually the architect said, no, that's not what it's about. It's about creating nature where you live, or enhancing nature where you live, not something to be purchased as well. And the other person said, oh, yes, but it's really, really expensive, so I don't want to pay that. So, yes, let's actually put the trees on the land right next to this site that we also own. So money, and we may not want to talk about it, but I can tell you it's a driver. And when there is legislation behind it, it is making a difference. It may not be from people's hearts, like we have it in our heart and in our mind, in our knowledge. We know it's the only way to go. For those who aren't in that culture yet, money will be powerful. So
absolutely, because that's the fear, right, with a lot of these credit programs, is that you are able to buy off the damage, but if the price is high enough, and if you can jack up the price high enough, then it can deter that kind of behavior happening. Obviously, the book is called The Nature of Our Cities, but I would have loved to call it The Nature of Where We Live, because it's not really, and there's lengthy discussions with the publisher about this too. They may have thought The Nature of Where We Live is a little long for a title, but the issue that I have with using the word cities is that people obviously, conjure up these ideas of a dense urban core when we think about cities, the central business district of a city, but it's not just about cities. It's about towns and villages and suburbs and really the nature of where we live, because no matter where we live, most likely it's in some kind of either suburbanized or urbanized setting. I mean, the vast majority of us live in some kind of urbanized setting, but it's really about fostering that connection of nature wherever it is that we might live. And so it just reminded me of that when you said that.
No, absolutely. It is about nature literally on your doorstep.
Exactly.
That's what makes a difference to us. Not having to drive to some wonderful nature park or rewilding. It's all good. Everything that's happening there is brilliant, but it needs to be able to physically touch our lives, which we know is so important in terms of studies. But I'm going to go on a completely different tack now to do with money. And I was super impressed by hearing about Yvonne Aki-Saviour.
Yes.
The mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone. Gosh, they've had a hard time, what with the war and massive landslides and things recently. But tell us about her campaign.
Yes, so she, as you mentioned, the country of Sierra Leone went through massive and deadly civil war. When just as that was kind of coming to an end in 2017, they suffered a massive landslides, mudslides and landslides in their capital of Freetown, much to do the damage of that, the property damage and the unfortunate loss of lives. I believe it was nearly 1,800 people that were killed in a single day because of it. So much of that was due to the massive deforestation that happened on the hillside. So Freetown really is built in this valley surrounded by these mountains that had historically always been forested. Much of that has been deforested to make way for new houses. Of course, a lot of slum-like houses, so not built, no really building regulations, homes that are easily destroyed in such a heavy rainfall. So that really, in an unseasonably heavy rainfall, coupled with the deforestation, coupled with that building and unregulated development on those hillsides, just caused an absolute catastrophe where, many people in Freetown called it, the day where part of the mountain came down. And it was absolutely devastating. And as a way to to really heal as a city from what happened there. The mayor, Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, she came up with this idea to do a massive tree planting campaign to plant, I believe it was 1 million trees, to put the goal out there. But do that in a radically different way. And the reason why I write about Freetown and Sierra Leone in the book is because what I like about their tree planting campaign is they kind of leapfrogged many of the errors that I think a lot of other cities across the Western Hemisphere have done, where they do tree planting campaigns and it just goes disastrously wrong because, well, what is wrong with tree planting campaigns is a whole other episode. But for the purposes of this example, what they did differently is they actually matched each tree planted with a local tree carer, so a tree steward that was tree guardian, really, that was responsible for taking care of that tree. And every time that they did that, whether it was watering or pruning or mulching or protecting it from vandalism and things like this, they could actually log that in an app called Tree Tracker, not to be confused with another technology I call in the book, which is also called Tree Tracker, but the app was called Tree Tracker. And they're able to upload photos of it. And for every action that they take, they actually get a micropayment sent directly to their phone as well. So there was a financial incentive also to take care of these trees. And I think that really changed a lot of the culture, because I think, people have these, there's a lot of different cultural associations that come with trees, right? We when we see trees, there's big perceptions of fear and of safety and risk to our safety associated with them. But they can also be these beautiful symbols of hope for healing. So I think it was really Free Towns, if I may speak for them, that really, this program really helped them kind of come more on the healing side of what trees are able to offer in this community. And it's proven very successful so far. I think they're nearly at their tree planting goal, and it's become a way to really engage the citizens in that as well.
That's fantastic. And I'd love to know more about that, actually. Maybe I'll try and speak to the mayor on the podcast.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll try and do that. But one of the things of climate change is going to get hot. And I felt so much for Dr. Vivek Shandas warning his bosses and the city, municipality, that it was going to be hot and it was going to be bad. And I felt for him. I had this image of him standing on a sidewalk with a loud halo going, here, yay, it's going to get hot, it's going to be really bad. So tell us what he did and who he was and what he did.
Yes, Professor Vivek Shandas. So he indeed, and I think that his frustration speaks to the frustration of a lot of different heroes, which I love how you call them throughout the book, is this idea that they for years had been saying, this is what's going to happen, this is the danger we need to do. And it wasn't really until that big catastrophic event that, well, we can only hope that things will change. And Vivek definitely was doing that. He had been saying, he is an urban heat researcher, and he had been saying for years that heat was not only going to come to Portland at some point. He's a professor at Portland State University in the Pacific Northwest in the US, but that not only that heat was going to come, but it was going to disproportionately impact certain groups of the population, especially people without AC, because why would you need air conditioning in a city like Portland, where it never gets hotter than, 25 degrees at its max in the summer, and it rains a lot? It's like, they think of like rainy Seattle, like Portland is like some 500 kilometers south of Seattle. Like, why would you need those kinds of things? And it got incredibly hot in the summer of 2021. There was a heat dome that happened all across Western Canada and the Western US, and it caused insanely hot temperatures, and that just stayed, meaning that they were there for day and night. And you might not think this, but it's specifically at night when those hot temperatures get particularly dangerous, because your body actually never gets a chance to cool down, making it specifically dangerous to those that don't have air conditioning, that are elderly, that have that are immunocompromised, that have health problems. And he could see that the areas that the greener neighborhoods were disproportionately cooler than the neighborhoods that had less trees. And so much so, he was measuring, 10, 15 degrees difference Fahrenheit in these neighborhoods. And he was able to do so by using this little infrared scanner. He actually did a lot of these measurements together with his son. And he really felt like the satellite-based measurements that he was doing at the time in his research were simply not good enough. They were simply too coarse scale. So beside his professor duties, he actually started a company called Kappa Strategies. And what Kappa Strategies did is they launched a campaign called Heat Watch. And basically what they did is they worked with an army of citizen science volunteers that got sent these low-cost sensors that they could attach either to themselves or their bikes or their cars. And they were asked to drive or ride a predetermined route over the course of several days within different periods to provide these hyper-local temperature measurements. And cities had never had hyper-local temperature measurements like this. And it gives really, really clearly this indication of where certain streets, where certain neighborhoods are hotter than others. And again, provides that knowledge is power, this information that we need to be able to know where to intervene and where to offer greenery interventions. And it was this beautiful come together of these, two characters, Vivek being one of them, and Fabio, who came up with Treepedia, and the other one, where I kind of conjure up this idea, like, what if the two of them, were able to work together and actually be able to show on the same map where we have these massive spikes in temperature increases during heat waves, and at the same time, where are we lacking greenery at the street level, and able to bring those two data sets together. Well, then I think you have a data set that nobody could argue with.
Fantastic work, and so important. This is again that using technology to help us live a better life in a city, because there are problems, and you have, I think, the longest chapter in the book is about wildfires. And
yes,
we had
there was a lot to say.
There was a lot to say, and we had our own experience of that in the UK a couple of years ago during the heat wave with the hottest weather we've ever had here. People will laugh at this temperature now, but it got to sort of 40 degrees centigrade, and we'll look back and laugh and think that wasn't too bad. But clearly, I mean, we hear in Australia and in America about these terrible wildfires and the scale of deforestation, and we could really talk, and the loss of people's lives. I mean, it's just unfathomable, the changes and the poor people. I feel so sorry for the devastation that causes. You write particularly movingly about Paradise as well. It's very, very sad. But on the flip side of that, again, technology is going to help. I mean, you talk about some of your heroes of Gus Boston and Burnbot. Tell us about him.
Yes, yeah. So Gus Boston, he's the battalion chief for Butte County, which is the county that Paradise sits in. And Paradise, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a relatively small town. Well, the bizarre thing is its urban classification was actually changed after the Camp Fire, the large devastating wildfire in November of 2018 that actually nearly completely wiped out Paradise. So the governor of California actually was forced to change the urban classification of Paradise, no longer from being a town, but actually being like an unclassified, basically being so small, so little people that live there that it no longer classified of being a town, which I just think speaks volumes about what happened there. Yeah. And again, this was something that people like Gus, who lived actually in Paradise, his home, miraculously, or perhaps not so miraculously, knowing what he knows about vegetation management, was actually one of the very, very few that was spared during the Camp Fire. He lost so much on that day. His sons, his family survived and their house survived, but his sons left Paradise shortly after that to live out of state with relatives to finish their high school, and then actually they never returned because there was nothing to do anymore. They lost everything in a single day. And both Gus and his wife, who was a social worker, and him as a battalion chief for the fire, for Cal Fire, they both really had their hands full. They stayed and tried to really pick up the pieces. And one of the things that Gus has become incredibly passionate about is this idea of prescribed burning, this idea that we can actually preventatively burn parts of the landscape and create these burn lines, as they're called, which basically stop when devastating wildfires hit them. So basically you're pre-burning an area so that it cannot be burned not if, but when a wildfire will inevitably pass through. And that's shown to be really, really successful. Except the problem with prescribed burning is that, like a normal fire, it emits a lot of smoke. And to be effective, you need to do it close to where people live, because otherwise it's not really going to help. And this is incredibly traumatic for people that have survived not one, but several wildfires at this point. Even just the smell of smoke is incredibly triggering and can send people into a panic attack. So prescribed burns is a really difficult thing to do, and to do effectively, it requires a lot of man hours, a lot of resources. It's backbreaking work. And there is this company from Silicon Valley called BurnBot, where they've essentially created this firefighting robot which clears brush and burns it in the same stroke. And it does so by producing only 5% of the smoke that a normal prescribed burn would. So I write about this in the book. One of the co-founders of BurnBot, Anakula Kaina, together with his co-founder, actually tested the technology in his very, very dense San Jose, a suburb out of San Francisco neighborhood, and nobody noticed the firefighting robot at work because it barely produces any smoke. You barely even notice it at work, which I think is such a great testament to the technology. And the most important thing about this as well is that the BurnBot is able, because everything happens within its apparatus, it is able to operate throughout a bunch of different seasons. And that's the main issue with prescribed burning. You don't want to do it in, the dead heat of the summer, when there's much more chance of the prescribed burning escaping, causing wildfires, because that's happened where we have prescribed burnings that have gone out of control and went on to cause devastating wildfires. But you're also not able to do it in the winter and the fall when the soil is too wet. So you have this very, very, very limited amount of season that you can actually do prescribed burning. So there's no way to do the amount of miles and acreage that we want to do prescribed burns on without the help of something like BurnBot, which is just an insane futuristic technology that I think can really, really help us try to get just some kind of handle on this massive wildfire problem.
That's absolutely brilliant. Let's hope that really takes off and helps with this enormous problem. And conversely, flooding. Flooding is really, in a way, within a very heavily urbanized city, is so devastating, isn't it? So, I mean, you read very movingly about a couple in Belgium who survived a flood, and they went to the Netherlands. And we tend to associate the Netherlands with brilliance on many things, actually. And we've been privileged to work. I kept reading the book. It's like a who's who of who we've interviewed on the podcast. Yes. Henry Kuppen, for example. And you've also referenced Cecil Konijnendijk, wonderful Cecil's work as well. But you write in the book about how civil engineering and high-level technology has created this thing, Room for Rivers. Could you just explain to the listeners what they do so well?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really twofold. And what I love so much about what the Netherlands has done in terms of flooding is this one appreciation, and it's in the name, room for the river, this idea that we need to provide nature with the room and the space to do its work. And what the ironic thing with a lot of the natural disasters that we're seeing, which are of course caused by nature, the ironic thing is that often the solution to them is to provide a bigger buffer of nature in our cities to be able to provide that resilience that we need. Whether that's bigger bioswales to be able to intercept a lot of the stormwater, whether that's really thinking clearly about what vegetation needs to be cleared and what species of tree can we be using that are actually fire resistant and able to provide a safe boundary from our urban developments. Nature really provides this beautiful buffer. So on the one hand, there's this realization from the Netherlands that we need to provide nature the space so that it can do its thing in times of need. But at the same time, that there is this role for technology to provide an assistance to that. So the Netherlands works with a highly sophisticated network of dikes and dams. I mean, it's known as, one of the 7 engineering wonders of the world. But what a lot of people don't know is the technology that plays is a whole network of sensors that operate day and night to measure things like the weather, like the water levels, like the maintenance of those different structures as well. And it's this really intricate system. So what I love about that is both this realization that, yes, give nature the room. Technology on its own is definitely not going to get us there. This network of, concrete dikes and dams will never save us from the floods. So give nature the space, but also look to technology to give you that assist where necessary.
Mm, absolutely brilliant. You write about the pandemic and the effect of people in the book as well, which we'll have to move on now because of lack of time. But you write really movingly about how it affects everybody in the daily walks, and actually an app that help you discover more works near your childhood home. But I loved a section in the book. I fell in love with somebody called Marjorie, a talking tree. Tell us about her.
Yes. Yeah, I agree yeah, so Marjorie, or Marije, if you really want to go
I'm
Dutch.
sorry, I did try and it was rubbish.
No, I like Marjorie. I like Marjorie. That can be her UK cousin.
Yeah.
No, I would not expect. Marije is a very Dutch name that is not easy to pronounce. Marije is indeed a talking oak tree in the north of Amsterdam, and she discusses at length, or I should say, her voice actor discusses at length what it's like to be the only tree in the middle of a town square and away from all of her tree friends, which she's no longer connected with, as we've discussed via her mycorrhizal associations in the soil with her tree roots. And the reason why she's able to have a voice is because of a woman named Puk van Dijk, who came up with this idea to give trees a voice by using this technology called geolocated sound, which essentially it operates much like an immersive audio tour, except that instead of at every location you're scanning a QR code for the next bit of audio, it actually triggers the next audio segment based on your GPS location. So you go to the start place of this immersive audio tree talking tour, you press play, you put your phone in your back pocket, you don't look at it for the next hour and a half as you're led on this audio immersive experience of these talking trees. And Marije was one of these 6 talking trees. And the idea of the tree talking tour was that it translated a lot of interviews from residents in that neighborhood into stories as if they were directly coming from the tree. And what is so great about this technology is that because the GPS location triggers the audio, often you could hear the tree before you could see it. And it might say something like, hey, like I'm over here, just a couple steps for it. Yep, just over here. Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm the big one with the beautiful crown and the big leaves and long branches. Don't I look pretty? For example, there was a tree who was quite obsessed with herself. And there was another tree who was coughing before you heard him. And he was planted right next to a highway, and he was talking about these issues of urban pollution. And there was another tree who was it was a ginkgo balboa, and it was supposed to represent the immigrant tree and what it was like to be, this ginkgo balboa, this exotic tree with all of these different native species around. And really the idea being that it was drawing a lot of parallels between deeply human issues that people go through, whether that's immigration, pollution, deforestation, gentrification, urban pollution, all these ideas, these issues that humans go through, a lot of trees go through as well. And it anthropomorphized trees in a really, really powerful way. And I love this example because it's so replicable in every city around the world.
And in a similar vein, also friend of the show, Yvonne Lynch, and in Australia at the time then, and giving trees an email address with unintended consequences.
Yes. Yeah. She was dealing with a big issue, which was the fact that many trees were dying due to also a heat wave and a drought. And a lot of people had questions and were frustrated. And she decided each tree already had an ID number, and she decided to link that ID number together with her team to an email address, thinking that that would offer a good management solution and being able to better manage her trees in this way. But what she didn't expect was that people would start writing love letters to these email addresses, digital notes of affections, saying, thank you so much for being here. You were here at a time of need. I write about one tree email that she got, which was from a woman thanking a gum tree outside of a hospital for being there with her when her twins were in the NICU, and now she drives past that tree, with her teenage twins in the back seat, and could not be grateful for the support and the solace that tree gave to her. I think it's just this beautiful example that this love and this intrinsic value that we feel for trees and for nature, many of us anyways, that it's there. It just, technology kind of needed to bring it out.
Yes, and that again adds power to the argument that we need nature. Love of trees is in our DNA. We evolved because of trees in terms of providing us initially shelter so our brains could grow, so we could sleep safe at night, things to build with, cooking food, so that increased our brain power. You know, there's a reason why we love them. And
Yes.
but there is a disconnect, and this is the sort of nature deficit disorder that Richard Louv has described, who I've also interviewed, and it's a real problem with a sort of nature blindness that people have in a city, not even being aware. And I've come across this because I'll speak to somebody and say, "Oh, it's over there by say the London plane tree or whatever that tree." Oh, do you mean by the McDonald's? You know, it's we're all
Never noticed that
perceiving.
tree.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
We're all perceiving the world. We're all developing our own reality, but really, it has created in some people this nature blindness, and yet
Yeah.
on a subconscious level, nature is definitely affecting. So even if you're not able to name anything or are particularly aware of the minutiae of detail within a tree pit, of the soil and everything, it's still having an impact on your
Yeah.
physical and mental health. But you go on in the book, and we are running out of time, but you talk about these other heroes who've developed these incredible apps using AI to help identify and record, and tell us some of the consequences again of young folk going out, finding, uploading images and using an app. I think that species have been rediscovered, haven't they?
They have, yes. And I think the problem with nature deficit disorder, which Richard Louv coined, he coined it, of course, because he was seeing this really similar symptoms to what we might look at as ADHD. This idea that we're not able to concentrate, that we have this kind of this loss of cognitive ability, this loss of room to grow, and this restlessness, and that much of that can be cured by just spending more time in nature. But I would say the bigger problem is the nature deficit disorder that we face as adults, because that is something that we then pass on to our children. If we ourselves are not prioritizing spending time outside in our nature, how could we possibly, imagine our children to do such a thing too? I mean, we really, as parents, must lead by example in many ways. But I think a lot of parents are left scratching their heads, knowing it's important, but not quite sure where to start. And I think that's where a lot of these mobile augmented reality games that I talk about in the book, where they use local biodiversity and local biodiversity hotspots to be able to provide educational concepts or content about these areas in urban nature, is really exciting. And basically how they work is they're meant to facilitate this interaction. So it's not meant that my worst nightmare would be seeing a bunch of kids out in the park with their face glued to a screen. No, that's not what I would want to see. But what I would love to see is people using, or children using their parents' phone, for example, and saying, okay, this is my next assignment. Put the phone away, and off they go for the next hour to complete the assignment, much like they would if they had a worksheet or a book, for example. But there's another really great resource out there called the City Nature Challenge. And the City Nature Challenge is a global urban competition. It started in 2016. They just had their 9th annual Bio Blitz this past April. And it's this 4-day competition where as many cities and residents get involved. This year, over 700 cities took part to try and photograph and identify and upload as many wildlife, flora, and fauna observations to the iNaturalist platform as possible. And the City Nature Challenge has been wildly successful in getting people out there. It started as a small competition in 2016 between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and that's what it was for the first 3 years. Then slowly more cities in California took part, in the US, and now over 700 cities have took part. This past year, more than 2.5 million observations were made worldwide. Something like 80,000 people were participating. And it's this brilliant way to get out there as a family, appreciate the urban nature that's around you, but also learn about it. Because I really believe the more we understand, the more we learn, the more that we'll feel inclined to protect it and to enhance those areas as well. So it's a brilliant way to try and get your family outside more and doing something that not only gets you engaged in nature, but is also contributing to global biodiversity research as well.
Absolutely. And as you say, if you know it, if you see it, you tend to value it.
Yes.
So really, really powerful. And
yeah,
the
and
other
there's some
thing,
crazy crazy. I was just going to say there's some crazy research out there too that shows that the more time we spend in nature, both as adults and as children, the more likely we are to exhibit pro-environmental behaviors, as is defined by the research study.
And also, we know it's good for us, and nature prescriptions, what might that look like in the future?
Yeah, I love this idea of, general practitioners prescribing time outside. And what I would love to see is that we can have these wilderness camping trips, but within the city limits. This idea that we can do stargazing within the city limits, that we can do river rafting and these like survivalist expeditions within the city limits, that you might be sent on a nature retreat, but within the city limits. I think there's so many, brilliant wilderness-esque, which there's a ton of research to show how important it is to be in areas of vast wilderness. And of course, if you have the time and the resources and the time off work to get to those places, I highly encourage you to do so. But as you said in the beginning of this, Sharon, it is all about the nature at our doorstep. And the more that we can bring this sense of awe and wild and wilderness into our city limits, the better off we will be as adults, and absolutely it will be better for our children as well.
I totally agree. And what do you think society would look like if we all had a daily dose of nature?
Oof. Hopefully, I think a lot happier and healthier. I think it would do wonders for the state of public health. I mean, just thinking about the issues with obesity and vitamin D deficiency and those things in general. But on a deeply, more spiritual level, I think it would bring us closer to the earth, closer to where we came from, closer to one another. And I think in a highly divided society that we live in today, highly polarized, right, left, white, black, all these things, I think it provides that one thing that we can all agree on, that one thing that brings us together. And I think we've lost that in a highly secular society. We've lost these centers of faith. And I think nature is still that one thing that we have that can bring all of us and unite all of us together. So I would love to see more of that.
Excellent. Nadina, it has been awesome. I feel like I've hardly touched the sides with your brilliant book. It's a page turner, folks. If you think you don't want to read another nature book, I tell you, this is important. And I feel so optimistic about the future. Just putting together emerging technology, AI, and nature has got to be the way forward. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sharon. It was a pleasure to be on, and I'm so thrilled at the way you structured this podcast interview, getting to explain, as you rightly call them, the heroes that are at the heart and the center of the Internet of Nature movement and at the heart of this book, The Nature of Our Cities. It just felt like the right way to do it. It's all about them and putting them in the spotlight.
Hey Nadina, you're a fellow podcaster, aren't you?
I am, yes.
So where can people find you?
The Internet of Nature podcast, and I'm very happy to say that there has been some crossover guests as well. I also did an episode with Richard Loeb and with Matthew Wells and with Cecil Konijnendijk. So I think your listeners are really going to enjoy it as well.
Yep, excellent. So check it out. I'm really pleased to be with John Orchard, the Chief Executive of Woodland Heritage. Hiya, John. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks, Sharon. I'm really glad to be sharing the news that we have launched applications for our Woodland to Workshop course. This course really links tree growers together with wood users. You come along and are supported by knowledgeable practitioners and eminent speakers from across the timber industry. The course is based in the woodland, in the timber yard, the sawmill, and the joinery workshop for across several days. And it's a really intense and practical course that will give attendees incredible knowledge that we hope will last their lifetime. The course is delivered by Whitney Sawmills, by Evolving Forests, by the Duchy of Cornwall, by the New Model Institute of Technology and Engineering in Herefordshire, and by Prior and Rickett Silviculture as well. The course is overseen by Woodland Heritage, and we're really glad that people from the Duchy of Cornwall, like Geraint Richards, who was one of the founders of the course, is still involved several years later. And other tutors include Graham Taylor, Jez Ralph, Dermot Doyne, and also Ben from the Duchy of Cornwall, Ben Anderson. It's an incredible experience which really embeds knowledge about how to grow trees, how to use wood, and the really important connections between that. The course is attended by foresters in the making, people that manage woodland, people that make things out of timber, from timber framers and furniture makers, through to scientists and researchers. And we think that by bringing all those people together, we can really learn some incredible things.
And it'd be so good to share other people's perspective as well, because so often we're stuck in our own groove. This
Yeah.
sounds like an absolutely brilliant course. So, how can people join in? Where can they find you?
So if they visit woodlandheritage.org, or you can search for Woodland to Workshop course, and the course runs from Tuesday the 24th of September to Thursday the 26th of September this year in 2024. There will be dates for 2025 and 2026 as well, so you can register your interest for those now. And the cost is £600 per person, and there may well be some bursary available. And the good news is as well is that there's CPD in place with the Institute of Chartered Foresters as well, if CPD is an important part of your experience. And it takes place, as I said, in different locations across Herefordshire, ranging from some of the Duchy of Cornwall woodlands to the Whitney sawmills. And the kind of home base for this year will be this incredible educational institution and an incredible educational space. I was really lucky to attend the course last year, and I think the thing that stayed with me is that the vital importance of that broad church of people that come along. If you are really, really serious about making amazing things out of wood, you simply must know more, as much as possible, about growing trees. And if you're really serious about productive woodlands and managing trees, I think it's vital as well that you really understand what a timber framer wants from an oak tree. And by sharing all of that and working together, we can really do some incredible things.
Oh, that sounds absolutely brilliant. And can anybody come from across the world, or is it just a UK focus?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would have to check if you've ever had any international international people attending, but you'd be very welcome, I'm sure. And I would imagine that by learning how we do things in this country, there's some incredible things that you could take back to your roost at home.
Excellent. Well, for those who want to find out more, go to the website. And also, we had the privilege of speaking to Simon Burville in an episode about woodland heritage in Tree Lady Talks last November. So check out our back catalogue. But John, so good to see you. And also, well done for having such an apt name. John Orchard from Woodland Heritage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon.